1985, Seoul, South Korea. A man in an expensive suit walks into a police station, not to turn himself in, to deliver a message. His name is Lee Dong-jae. He's the underboss of one of Korea's 4 most powerful crime families. He walks past 50 police officers. None of them stop him. He enters the police chief's office, closes the door, and for the next 10 minutes, tells the chief exactly how things will work in this district. Who gets arrested? Who doesn't? Which businesses pay protection? Which politicians get donations? Then he walks out. No handcuffs, no charges, nothing. Because in 1980s Korea, the Kkangpae didn't fear the police. The police feared them. You've probably never heard the word Kkangpae. The Korean government would prefer it stays that way. Unlike the Italian Mafia, the Yakuza, or the Triads, Korea's organized crime families have been systematically erased from history. But they existed. They were brutal. And for nearly 4 decades, they ruled Korea. This is the story of the Kkangpae, Korea's forgotten mafia kings. Kkangpae is a Korean word that roughly translates to gang or organized crime group, but that translation doesn't capture what it really meant. In Korea, the Kkangpae weren't just street gangs, they were institutions. Crime families with hierarchies, territories, codes of conduct, and political connections that went all the way to the top of government. The Kkangpae emerged in the chaos of post-Korean War South Korea, the 1950s. The country was devastated, millions were dead, the economy was destroyed, and the government, weak and corrupt, couldn't maintain order. In that vacuum, organized crime flourished. Street gangs began forming in Seoul, Busan, Incheon, controlling black markets, gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. But by the 1960s, some of these gangs evolved into something bigger. They became crime families. The Kkangpae operated with strict hierarchies. There was a boss called the Hyungnim, or Big Brother. Below him were underbosses, captains, soldiers, and associates. Loyalty was absolute. Betrayal meant death. They even had initiation ceremonies, mixing Korean Confucian traditions with criminal rituals. New members would swear blood oaths, pledging loyalty to the family above everything. By the 1970s, 4 major Kkangpae families dominated Korea, and together they built an empire that would last for decades. By the 1970s, 4 Kkangpae families controlled Korea's underworld. The Myeongdong-pae. The Myeongdong-pa controlled Seoul's Myeongdong district, the commercial heart of the capital. Prime real estate, nightclubs, restaurants, theaters, shopping. They ran protection rackets across the district. Every business paid them. If you didn't, your store burned down. If you still refused, you disappeared. Their boss was Kim Tae-chan, known as the gentleman gangster. Always wore expensive suits, spoke softly, never got his hands dirty. But everyone knew, cross Kim Tae-chan, and you'd be found in the Han River with your throat cut. The Dongdaemun-pae. If the Myeongdong-pa were sophisticated operators, the Dongdaemun-pa were street enforcers. They controlled a grittier working-class area, gambling dens, loan sharking, illegal markets. Their boss, Park Sung-ho, was a former street fighter who'd killed his first man at 16. He ruled through fear. His enforcers carried knives and baseball bats. They collected debts by breaking legs. The Busan family. While Seoul had competing families, Busan, Korea's second-largest city, was controlled by one dominant family. They ran the port, smuggling, dock worker extortion, control of shipping companies, black market goods from Japan and China. Their boss, Choi Byung-seok, lived in a mansion overlooking the ocean. He owned construction companies, real estate, nightclubs. He had relationships with military generals, governors, members of the National Assembly. The Incheon Syndicate. The fourth family controlled Incheon's port. They specialized in smuggling, drugs from Southeast Asia, weapons from China, counterfeit goods, people trafficking. Their boss, Hwang Jin-soo, was a former North Korean defector turned gangster, paranoid, brutal, brilliant. He trusted no one and killed rivals without hesitation. These were the Big Four, and by 1975, they effectively controlled Korea's underworld, and much more. The Kkangpae's power wasn't just about violence, it was about control. Politics, Every major family had politicians on their payroll, campaign contributions, protection for rallies, intimidation of rivals. In return, politicians ensured police investigations went nowhere, that prosecutors looked the other way, that gambling dens operated without interference. In the 1970s, under President Park Chung-hee's dictatorship, this corruption reached its peak. The government needed the Kkangpae to maintain control, and the Kkangpae needed government protection. There are documented cases of Kkangpae bosses attending government meetings, sitting in on policy discussions, even advising on labor strikes. The Kkangpae weren't outside the system, they were part of it. Business. The Kkangpae controlled legitimate businesses too: construction companies, real estate, import-export. A family would start a legitimate construction company, then use extortion and political connections to win government contracts. They'd hire workers at low wages, cut corners, and pocket the difference. By the 1980s, some estimates suggest Kkangpae-connected businesses controlled 10 to 15% of Korea's construction industry. Fear, but ultimately, power came from fear. If you crossed them, you died. Journalists who wrote critical stories, beaten in alleys, or worse. Business owners who refused protection, stores burned, families threatened, rival gangsters executed publicly as warnings. In 1976, a small gang challenged the Myeongdong-pa's territory. The response was brutal. 7 rival members were found in a warehouse, tortured, executed, dismembered. The message: don't challenge the established order. And for years, nobody did. The late 1970s and early 1980s were the Kkangpae's golden age. Korea's economy was booming, Seoul was modernizing, money was flowing, and the Kkangpae were at the center. They controlled Seoul's nightlife entirely. Every entertainment district paid protection. Want to open a nightclub? You paid. Want to run a casino? You paid. Want your restaurant to avoid problems? You paid. The money was staggering. The Big Four collectively earned hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and they spent it lavishly. Kkangpae bosses drove Mercedes and BMWs, wore custom Italian suits, owned mansions in Seoul's wealthiest neighborhoods, dined with celebrities, businessmen, politicians. One famous story: in 1982, Kim Tae-chan threw a birthday party at a luxury hotel, over 500 guests, politicians, business tycoons, entertainment moguls. The party cost over $200,000, and the police provided security outside. This was the height of Kkangpae power. They were Korea's shadow government, but the violence was escalating. Gang wars became more frequent and brutal. Civilians got caught in crossfire. In 1983, a turf war resulted in a shootout in broad daylight in central Seoul. 5 people killed, including a civilian woman. The incident made international news. Korea was preparing for the 1988 Olympics. The government couldn't have violent gang wars making headlines. Something had to change. 1987, Korea's Democratic Revolution. After decades of military dictatorship, mass protests forced free elections. Democracy came to Korea, and with democracy came accountability. The new government needed to prove it was different. One of the easiest ways? Crack down on organized crime. In 1988, the government launched Operation Clean Korea, the largest anti-gang operation in the country's history. Thousands of police mobilized, warrants issued for hundreds of members, assets frozen, businesses raided. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Seoul Olympics were months away. The world would be watching. Over the next 3 years, the crackdown intensified. In 1990, Kim Tae-chan, the Myeongdong-pa boss who'd ruled Seoul for 2 decades, was arrested. His empire collapsed within months. Park Sung-ho was killed in a police shootout. Choi Byung-seok fled to the Philippines, was extradited, sentenced to 25 years. Hwang Jin-soo disappeared entirely. Some say he escaped to China. Others believe he was killed. His body was never found. By 1995, the Big Four were gone. Thousands of members in prison. The organizations that had ruled Korea for decades were shattered. But organized crime doesn't disappear. It adapts. Where are the Kkangpae today? Officially, they don't exist. The Korean government claims organized crime has been eradicated, but that's not entirely true. The old families are gone. Those names are relics, but organized crime didn't disappear. It evolved. Today's Korean organized crime operates differently. smaller cells, less public violence, more white-collar crime, cybercrime, financial fraud, drug trafficking through encrypted networks. Modern gangs learned from the Kkangpae's mistakes. Don't draw attention. Don't challenge the government openly. Stay in shadows. There are still gangs in Seoul, Busan, Incheon, but they're nothing like the 1970s to 80s Kkangpae. They don't control territories. They don't have political protection. They survive by being invisible. Some former members went legitimate, used criminal fortunes to start legal businesses. Today, there are wealthy businessmen in Korea whose fortunes were built on Kkangpae money, though they'd never admit it. Others served time and disappeared into obscurity. Some became informants, and some, like Hwang Jin-soo, simply vanished. Fates unknown. The Kkangpae's legacy is complicated. They represented everything dark about Korea's authoritarian past. Corruption, violence, criminals, and the state merged. But their story is part of Korea's history, a reminder of how far the country has come. Today's South Korea is a democracy, prosperous, safe. Organized crime no longer controls entire districts, but the shadows remain. In stories old-timers tell, in empty buildings that once housed operations, in families who lost loved ones. The Kkangpae ruled Korea for nearly 40 years. Then they were erased, systematically, deliberately, completely. But history doesn't disappear, it just gets buried. This was the story of the Kkangpae, Korea's forgotten mafia kings. Subscribe for untold stories from Korea's criminal underworld. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the shadows.